Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you very much for joining us. As we start off on this afternoon's session, I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind very briefly just introducing yourselves.
I am Marina Brilman. I'm the International Human Rights Policy Advisor of the Law Society of England and Wales. I'm also a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, its Latin American and Caribbean Centre, but I'm here to give evidence for the Law Society.
Thank you.
My name is Per Engström, and I'm Associate Professor of Human Rights at the Institute of Americas at UCL.
Hi, my name is Andre Gomez. I'm a UCL Associate Researcher at the Institute of the Americas, and I'm also part of Associate Researcher at Bristol University and part of Embrace Dialogue, a civil society organization in Colombia. I have worked previously with the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace in Colombia and the Ombudsman Office of Colombia.
Thank you very much. Could I ask forgive me, I'm slightly hard of hearing, so if you'd be very grateful, I'd be hugely grateful if you'd speak up as sort of loud and clearly as you feel you can. There are many questions that we're going to touch on, which I'm sure any of the three of you could answer. If you feel it's already been covered, please don't feel the need to repeat something else, but if you'd like to add something, then please do. I'll start, if I may, with a question on the respect for human rights and the rule of law, particularly today, perhaps. It's quite an important question. Is that increasing or decreasing in the region, and why would you say it was? Julie?
I think there's a difference between sometimes what is said in public in defense of the rule of law and human rights and the actions that are taken in practice. For the Law Society, we have three main concerns regarding rule of law in the region. The first of them are threats to judicial independence, especially in Venezuela, Colombia, to a certain extent in Guatemala. Secondly, the rise in attacks against human rights defenders, including lawyers, especially in Colombia after the signing of the peace agreement. And third, regional dynamics, and more specifically recently, I'm sure you're aware that pro-Sur member states, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Paraguay, and Chile, challenged the inter-American system of human rights. That happened before in 2012, led by Ecuador and Venezuela, so more left-wing governments. Now it's happening again, but by Southern Cone states and more right-leaning governments. And that is especially worrying, also taking into account the continuous underfinancing of the inter-American system of human rights at a period in time when there are serious challenges to the rule of law. And I'm happy to elaborate on any of those 3 points in the rest of the session.
Well, I agree with what Marina has said.
I'm very sorry. Would you mind speaking?
I agree with what Marina has said so
Thank you.
far. I guess in the case of Colombia, that is where I would like to focus more. There has been a threat to the transitional justice mechanism and the independence of this mechanism that was agreed in the Colombian peace process in 2016. And also, there is a very serious human rights crisis that has unfolded after the signing of the peace agreement. 2018 was the year with the largest number of human rights violations in Colombia in the last 10 years, and I think this needs to be taken into account.
Well, if I just may add to that, the overall picture is quite varied, so depending on where you look in the region. But if you'd like to focus on the Andean region in particular, and Colombia and Venezuela in particular, I think the broad picture is one in which the narrative surrounding Colombia since the adoption of the peace deal has been one of a positive development in terms of the supposed end of the armed conflict following the adoption of the peace deal. And this is contrasted with the steady deterioration in the case of Venezuela, if like. This is the kind of broad picture in the Andean region specifically. Although, as Andre and I would happy to elaborate on that, and I'm sure we will in a few moments, the situation in Colombia is really quite urgent, and the trend is one in which effectively we see the dismantling of the peace deal, and we see also increase in violence in Colombia in particular. But if you look across the region, it's very varied. I mean, there is a broader right-wing trend, politically speaking, as Marina highlighted, across Latin America, and we see a certain resurgence of a, let's call it an illiberal populist form of government, perhaps most clearly expressed in the case of Brazil and Bolsonaro, where we see very prominent and outspoken attack on the very idea of human rights, not speaking of the actual practice of human rights and extensive human rights violations in Brazil.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Mr. Gethens to...
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for coming along. That actually leads us quite nicely. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Colombian peace process. Can I just ask a more general question, first of all, which is, do you think the peace accords in Colombia have delivered change for the better for the rights of citizens? And then it would be interesting to go into more detail about some of the points that you've just raised as well.
Well, I think there were really high hopes that the peace deal was going to bring radical transformation to Colombian society, in particular in the most affected areas by the armed conflict and the poorer territories of the country. Unfortunately, after the peace deal was put for a referendum and the referendum was lost, the hopes of Colombian people have somehow been falling apart. And unfortunately, even though there has been some level of implementation of some of the dispositions, at least 23% of them have been implemented according to the Kroc Institute, there's still a large way to go in order to bring about the transformations that were promised by the peace deal. And what Colombians feel in regions like Putumayo, that I just visited 3 weeks ago, is that somehow there is a sense that the Colombian state is betraying them again. That during the Santos administration, there was a hope that things were going to change, that the government was going to start delivering a transformation in terms of economic, politics, and in the regions, and then that now, under the Duque administration, all those things are not happening. And in particular, in the case of Putumayo, for example, there is a very serious concern with the point 4 of the agenda that had to do with the national coca crop substitution program. And this was meant to have a comprehensive approach to solving the issue of illicit crops, and now it's turned into a military approach to try to solve that conflict and not bringing about the economic transformations that people were expecting in the territories. So it hasn't delivered what it was promised, thanks to the lack of political will of the new administration in Colombia.
Well, I would only answer that maybe that it has improved for people who live in the areas where there were direct hostilities between the state's armed forces and the FARC, who obviously now live in regions that are more peaceful in that regard. But the absence of the FARC has left a vacuum, as you know, and I think has been addressed in previous sessions, that has now been filled with different paramilitary groups, FARC dissidents, the ELN. So they're still not free from hostilities, it's just between different actors. And also the insecurity about, for example, land restitutions to victims of the armed conflict. That is somewhere a region where we see the biggest amount of threats, in a way, against lawyers who are involved in these land restitution claims and their clients. And then the other thing I would mention is that in most of those regions that André just referred to, there is almost a complete absence of the state. So if the state has any presence at all, it is a military presence, it's the armed forces, but there's no other state institutions to provide healthcare, education, anything else. So people who live there are basically left to their own devices.
Perhaps I could add, as André mentioned, there were great hopes. Many of us had great hopes with the adoption of the peace deal. Not least because, despite the many compromises that obviously any peace deal entails, I think we could say that the peace agreement was as comprehensive and as progressive, if you like, as one could have hoped for, given the very complex armed conflict that Colombia has undergone for many, many decades. And there were quite a few indicators that showed an improvement on certain measures around human rights. For example, levels of violence decreased in certain areas. The demobilization of FARC led to of course, a decrease in the kind of hostilities of the armed conflict and violence that entailed. But what we have seen, and particularly in recent couple of years, is a deterioration, and what we also see recently is what many would say a dismantling of key components of the peace deal. And one that has, of course, been in the news recently has to do with the special jurisdiction for peace and the Duque government's attempt to revise core components of the jurisdiction. I'm sure you might have questions around it, which we'll be happy to elaborate on. And this general political context has led to a spike in violence, and we also see number of massacres of civilians have increased. We have also seen, as Marina mentioned, the moving into former TARC territories of various armed actors, and the violence in these regions have led to quite extensive killings. And I think many observers are really quite concerned over the current situation.
Well, actually, can I ask about exactly that? I mean, do you think there's, and you've just hinted at that, Dr. Engstrom, is there adequate access to justice for citizens, or is there perceived adequate access to justice? And also, if I could just broaden it out, are President Duque's actions seen, or are they undermining efforts to strengthen the rule of law?
So I think it's important to recognise the work that the transitional justice comprehensive system has conducted in recent year or so, and there have been quite important advances in a number of cases in special jurisdiction, both involving military personnel and FARC ex-combatant. The second point, I just contextually want to highlight that when we talk about access to justice in the Colombian context, it is important to understand that generally there are very high levels of impunity, and this has been the case historically. There's some estimates of, for example, impunity for violent crime reaching near perfect impunity in the 90s. So 90% of crimes, or more than so, don't get resolved or left in impunity. So the general context is not conducive for general access to justice, and this, of course, I say this affects marginalized communities in particular, and there are, of course, great obstacles to access to justice for communities, indigenous communities, Afro-Colombian communities, and as Marina mentioned, particularly in rural areas. And of course, these population groups overlap in important ways. So the transitional justice comprehensive system has, in my view, great potential if it is allowed to operate as it has been designed to. Of course, there's going to be plenty of problems. This is the nature of transitional justice anyway. But at the moment, we see a lack of political support, as Andre mentioned, for the proper functioning of the transitional justice system.
If I can maybe add
Please.
to that, with regards to access to justice, I agree with Par's points about the lack of access to justice, especially in the regions and for indigenous communities. I would add to that because of the threats that lawyers face who take on human rights-related cases, there are relatively few lawyers who take those kinds of cases because of the risks that they themselves face in performing that kind of work, as well as their families. So that means that access to justice for human rights-related cases is severely reduced because it's hard to get a lawyer who is willing to put their own life on the line, as it were, to get justice. On your second point about actions taken by the current government, I would say it's again a point of public discourse endorsing rule of law and human rights, especially at the beginning of the presidency, the signing of the Pact for Life for protection of social leaders, human rights defenders, and journalists. But subsequently, actions that go against that kind of discourse. For example, obviously, his objections to the special jurisdiction for peace, which we can go into further if you like. Budget cuts have been announced. The National Development Plan is being discussed in Congress. I have heard proposed budget cuts of around 20% for the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, 40% for the Truth Commission, 60% for the unity that has been set up to look for missing persons and human remains. So that doesn't disclose a political will to actually allocate resources to the implementation of the peace accords. Also, the effort last year to introduce military jurisdiction within the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, that was not approved by Congress, so that's out now. But that also shows an intent, obviously, to tinker with the agreement. And then specifically with regard to human rights defenders, the public prosecutor has publicly said that attacks against certain human rights defenders are isolated crimes, may be linked to drug trafficking, thereby not recognizing that there is a systematic element to attacks on human rights defenders because of the work that they do. And obviously that is a precondition to change the situation for human rights defenders and lawyers in the country.
Probably I could just add the following, is that with Embrace Dialogue, we carried out 2 very short research in Arauca and Catatumbo, and then in Valledupar and Tuluá, in order to try to understand how the mechanisms of alternative conflict resolution on the ground were in tune with the ordinary justice system. And this in particular because the peace deal with the FARC meant that it was very important to find a way to understand the links between community justice and ordinary justice. And the whole idea was that, of course, one way of strengthening the rule of law is also strengthening the link between both of them. And what we discover in our research is that this link hasn't been strengthened at all, that the ordinary justice system doesn't really rely on the community justice mechanisms in these regions. And in regions like Catatumbo and Arauca, the only justice practice that you have is the one carried out by the communities. So in some ways, what I think is quite important, and we have seen because we were in discussions with the Ministry of Justice in November last year, is that there is a will to try to start thinking about how you synchronize these 2 sort of systems. But unfortunately, the problem that we have in this moment is the level of polarization in Colombia. And because President Duque keeps claiming that he is wanting to build peace with legality, but he constantly stigmatizes, and some of his members stigmatizes members of the FARC, and we are still in a constant battle between the ones who supported the peace agreement and the ones who did not support the peace agreement. He hasn't been able to focus on those developments. So in this moment, we have a very serious obstacle, that is that this polarization is getting on the way on letting these institutions do the work and actually strengthen the rule of law in these territories.
So just as a final question, Mr. Chair, can I ask things after all the Foreign Affairs Committee, is the UK, in your opinion, doing enough to support the peace process? And should the Foreign Office be taking a stronger line with the Duque administration in terms of underlining the UK's support for the peace accords?
I think the UK government and the embassy in Bogota have supported the peace agreement. They've also supported the statutory law that has now been objected to by Duque. Of course, it's always possible to take a harder line, but I think that has been expressed, and I think that is quite clear. And of course, both the peace process and the statutory law have received a lot of international support by the Security Council at the beginning of this year and at the end of last year, by the Office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations in Bogota, by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and as soon as Duque published his objections against the statutory law, 1 or 2 days later, a letter was sent to the Secretary General of the United Nations, signed by all of the FARC negotiators and all of the state negotiators for the peace agreement, expressing concern about these objections and emphasizing the autonomy of the special jurisdiction for peace. So I think there's been a lot of international support, including from the UK, and I think the position is clear.
If I could just add very quickly to emphasize this point, I think the UK and the Foreign Office, but the UK government generally has several channels of through which they can express and act in support of the peace agreement and the implementation of peace agreement. And again, it's really important that we understand that the peace deal is in balance, right? So we have through the UN Security Council, which has a mandate to follow the implementation of the peace deal, and the UK, of course, has a pivotal role to play in the UN Security Council. Marina mentioned the embassy and the Foreign Office have done really quite important work locally through a series of very high-profile and very skilled ambassadors and staff at the embassy in Colombia. Now, there are of course other multilateral channels through which the UK could potentially play an important role in Colombia. The EU would have been, or is actually one, if I may allow myself to say so.
Please.
I know that the UK played a very important role in the peace process. You have invested time, energy, resources. It was a fundamental role, the one you played in the UN Security Council in order to get the UN mission to Colombia. I think the embassy has been vocal in trying to tell President Duque that he needs to honor the peace deal. However, I also think that you could do more, because what Par is saying is that Colombia was the country that, according to the UN Security Council, was the only hope for the world only 3 years ago. And it's not possible that today the president of Colombia has objected the statutory law that is going to allow the most comprehensive transitional justice system in the world to work. And I don't think that is enough to just express concern. I think you need to explore harder measures from the UN Security Council, and I think the UK needs to own this more seriously, because if this doesn't happen, we already know what happened in Rwanda in 1994, that a failed peace process ended up in a horrible genocide. And Colombia is a country that we have seen going through cycles of violence since 1958 and has never been able to stop this, because the political elites betray the agreements that they do. And this is important. The people in Colombia are waiting for the international community to express further pressure on President Duque, because it's a commitment to the world, not only to Colombian society.
Thank you, Chair. What particular issues are facing women human rights defenders in Colombia?
So, well, if I may start, and I'm deferring then to my colleagues. So, one of the characteristics of the armed conflict in Colombia was, of course, very high levels of sexual violence, particularly targeting women. And what many of us who followed the negotiations around the peace agreement and the eventual adoption of the peace deal saw as an important, again, part of the comprehensive deal was what is not very elegant, kind of be put, but the kind of gender component of the peace agreement. So it kind of cuts across the various dimensions of the peace deal. And again, there were a lot of hope invested in those areas of the peace agreement, the involvement of women in negotiations, the involvement, the explicit addressing of sexual crimes that have been committed as part of the armed conflict, and efforts to adopt specific reparation policies that took this gender component into account. So again, I think the broader point I just want to connect your question to is that the mechanisms and the tools are there to address the decades of violence and human rights violations that have taken place in Colombia. And the hope is that they're allowed to work as best as they can.
I agree with what Par just said, especially about the sexual violence. That is a trait. Also, threats directed at women human rights defenders often include that component, and that is something that should obviously be looked at also in the investigation of those threats and of crimes committed against women human rights defenders. There needs to be more sensitivity and a gender differentiated approach within investigations by the police and the prosecution services. The other point to mention is maybe that there are a lot of single mothers, madres cabezas de familia, as they are called, which is kind of a real term or a concept in Colombia, who have either been left caring for their families because their husbands or partners have been killed in the conflict, and a lot of those are also community leaders. And unfortunately, last year, 2018, saw a significant increase in aggression, killings, and threats against women human rights defenders. A report was published just last week by a national NGO platform that also works with the Office of the United Nations of the High Commissioner of the United Nations in Colombia, that showed that increase in threats against human rights, women human rights defenders specifically. And I can send that report to the committee in writing if that's helpful after the session.
And I guess in terms of, just to put some numbers in terms of the killings, what we have seen between the signing of the peace agreement, November 2016, and March 31st, 2019, is that 15% of the killings are against women human rights defenders. And in the presidency of Ivan Duque, since August last year until March this year, we have 60% of women human rights defenders killed in Colombia, and the other one is 83%. And we have also an increase in 2018 on sexual violence on 500%. We went from 2 cases to 6 cases, which is, well, dramatic in terms of what's happening there.
Can I just add one point? That with all of these statistics, I think it should be taken into account that there is a very big underreporting because people in the regions are afraid to denounce any crimes that have been committed against them to the police, because in many regions the same people that are the police forces by day sometimes form part of other groups by night. And that's not to say that that's the case in the whole country, but that's certainly the case in some of the rural areas. So there's a great fear and therefore an underreporting.
Yeah, and that would be the same for indigenous women groups as well.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah, and probably to add that the numbers vary according to the different reports. And I was just talking about the number of killing of human rights defenders according to the Comisión Colombiana de Juristas in a report that just was handed to me before I came here. But also to say that Somos Defensores, that is a coalition of NGOs, is saying that in 2018, out of 805 human rights violations, 235 of those were carried out against women. So the percentage in terms of other human rights violations is rather large too.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Chris, do you jump in quickly?
Yes, just Colombia has I think the largest number of displaced people within their own, still displaced within their own country, in any country in the world. I think certainly a very large number. From what you're saying, Mr. Gomez-Suarez, it sounds as if the peace process completely stalls, there's a danger of civil war. Is that, or of significantly enhanced violence again? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
because you compared it to Rwanda.
Well, the main problem that we have in Colombia is that if we think about the previous peace processes, when we had negotiations, the levels of violence usually went down for a while. That happened in 1984 and 1985. That happened in 1999, 1990. That happened between 1998 and 2000. But once the peace process ends, you have a rather serious increase of violence in Colombia. According to the main national newspaper, El Espectador, in last weekend edition, there are today in Colombia 26 illegal armed groups operating in the different territories of Colombia. According to Fundación Paz and Reconciliación, 10% of the members of the FARC who had disarmed had gone back to take up arms. And according to them, there are 2,500 members in the ELN. So, and according to them, there are more than 3,000 paramilitary members in the Clan del Golfo. So when you start thinking about that, 26 of these illegal armed groups in the territories, when you have a government that is not delivering to the people, and people start feeling trapped in between that, and when you have a further militarization of the solution to the security issues, instead of having a human security approach, as it was agreed in the peace deal in Colombia, then the most likely scenario is that this trend of escalation of violence that we have seen since 2016 is going to go even further. And there is a risk, of course.
Sorry, Chair, I should have declared my interest as well, which is that I have. I went to Colombia last year, paid for by AB Colombia, but to play devil's advocate, some people in the Duque administration and perhaps Mr. Uribe might say, these are all terrible people, they were always going to go back to the FARC, it was preposterous that we ever came to deal with them in the first place, and this is all inevitable. Whereas I think what you're saying is, actually, there were, part of the peace process was meant to be the reintegration of former fighters for the FARC into other professions and other, retraining and all the rest of it. And because that has not happened, they have had next to no choice. Is that what you're saying?
Not only that, 136 members of the FARC have been killed since 2016. So there are not security guarantees for some of them. Just last week, one member of the FARC was killed by an army unit, and it was castrated, and his body was going to be disappeared. So what you have is, of course, the government is not delivering in terms of the reincorporation of the FARC, and this is creating a very serious issue. So as it's not only not delivering in the reincorporation of the FARC, but it's not delivering in terms of the National Crop Substitution Plan, and it's not delivering in terms of the rural agrarian reform, and it's not delivering in terms of the comprehensive transitional justice system. What we are doing is that we are creating the perfect conditions for an emergence of violence, where it's not because all the evil guys of the FARC who went back to take up arms, but it's like we didn't solve the structural conditions that have created the conflict in Colombia and have maintained the conflict for the last 53 years.
May I just reinforce a point here, which I think is important. In very broad terms, I think it's fair to say that FARC as an organization, as a military political organization, delivered its part of the deal in terms of demobilization, broadly speaking. Then, of course, you would be able to find plenty of cases, and of course, of distant factions of FARC that have decided not to demobilize for a number of reasons, right? But the broader point here is that the FARC delivered demobilization. They held up their part of the bargain of demobilizing in these designated zones, and they were promised reintegration. They were promised a whole quite comprehensive package that, broadly speaking, has not been delivered to them, which has led to a situation in which quite significant number of FARC ex-combatants have left these zones. Now, not all of them, of course, have taken up arms again, right? But there are, I think, fair to say, a fair number that have, right? So I think that is an important part to keep in mind, that FARC delivered its part of the deal.
Fine. Royston, you'll just come in.
Can I talk to you about land rights and about farmers being driven off their properties? Is there enough support and protection for citizens, and is a rise in armed group activity a factor in people being driven from their properties?
I think the short answer is there's not enough protection, and yes, they're being driven off their lands because of the activities that take place in those regions. As I mentioned, the restitution of land to victims of the armed conflict is very difficult and has been since the victims' law came into force. People representing those victims also have huge difficulties and face severe threats. And a problem is also the formalization of the title to the land. It's very difficult to get a title that is then recognized. And once they do get a title, they're immediately pressured to give that title to someone else, usually paramilitary groups or other interested groups. So I would say it's a huge issue.
And according to the Colombian Commission of Jurists, what we have is a very worrying trend, and is that in the peace deal agreed that 16 special development zones for land rights were going to be created across the country. And what we have seen is that there is a pattern of violence, that most of the people who get killed in Colombia, who are communal leaders, indigenous leaders, community leaders, and peasant leaders, around 100 of them were killed in 2018. They were killed because they were in those territories. And those territories intersect with another 16 zones for the substitution of illicit crops. So what you can see is that there is a really worrying pattern. The regions in which the state was meant to go and build infrastructure, to talk to the communities, to discuss with them development projects, to do all these sort of things in order for them to leave aside the illegal crops. And in regions where you were going to give land titles to the campesinos who actually did not have land titles, in those regions is where you have the largest number of the killings in the country since the signing of the peace agreement. And I guess, so to answer your question, is there is no protection for land rights in the framework of the implementation of the peace agreement, unfortunately.
I would add one thing to that. And that is not so much the development, also the development projects for people to leave aside the cultivation of illicit crops, but also development projects carried out by multinational companies in some of those areas, often in indigenous lands or lands of Afro-Colombian communities. For example, big mining projects, big infrastructure projects. Those projects usually give rise to a lot of threats against human rights defenders and lawyers in those areas and to indigenous communities. So that's an added factor of complication, as you will. It all coincides in the same territories usually.
Okay. So can I come just very quickly back, Mr. Gomez-Suarez? What you're saying is there is a direct connection between land rights and the level of killing in areas of the community.
I think what most human rights organizations would say is that there is that pattern of violence. I mean, this important research that was carried out by the Colombian Commission of Jurists, and now that there is some research carried out by the National University of Colombia, shows that they are linked, that those regions where there was meant to be new land titles are the regions where most of the leaders are being killed, and most of the leaders who have been killed were leaders who were asking for those land titles or who were participating in the mechanisms that were created by the peace agreement in order to build the development plans in those regions. Now, what probably I should emphasize too is that in those regions, the vacuum left by the FARC, as Par rightly said, the FARC honor the agreement. But in those regions where FARC left and there was a vacuum there, the paramilitaries are taking over. So where there is paramilitary presence, usually what's happening is that the social leaders are being killed because they are the ones saying, we want the peace agreement to be implemented. We don't want anything else. You government signed this, we want the implementation of that. And they are getting killed. And in some cases, those regions also intersect with the special transitory reincorporation zones of the FARC. So as you can see, if you do a zoom in the map of Colombia, you could see that the killings are taking place mainly in 16 regions of the country where you have demobilization of FARC members, where you used to have illicit coca crops, where you needed to do a sort of land reform, and where you needed to do some legal titling there. And in those regions, you have a new illegal armed group coming in, or many, we don't know how many, fighting for that territory and killing the leaders who actually were the ones who were going to help the state to build the rule of law in a post-conflict society.
Thank you very much. Did you want to come back in, Chris?
So I think, just to clarify, I think there are different elements of this land right, aren't there? There's the restitution of stolen lands, which was promised under the peace accord, where sometimes there was difficult title to prove and so on, and that was one part, and that hasn't happened, as I understand you're saying. Secondly, there was the promise of terreno baldío, or sort of government land, as it were, that was to be given, parcelled out to people so that they could have lands to work on either as campesino or as indigenous peoples. There was to be new protections for indigenous lands. And none of those three things have happened, and on top of that, you're saying that there are new land is anew being stolen off people. Is that right? Is that the kind of four elements of what we have now?
But if you allow me to clarify,
sure.
Yes, of course, there is new land grabbing taking place because the numbers of IDPs in Colombia have increased in the last 2 years, according to CODES, one of the NGOs.
The number of IDPs?
Internally displaced people. So they've been, new campesinos in some of the regions have been expelled out of those territories, so that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that the government also promised that it was going to help the FARC members to reincorporate into society and to have economic projects, so to have a land to work in. Yeah. And that land has not been given to them. So today, a very serious issue that we have with former members of the FARC is that they don't know what is going to happen with them after August 2019, that is the end of the special transitory reincorporation zones. And they don't have land to work in. That's another issue that probably should be added to this, but the other two elements that you mentioned, they were, as you rightly said so.
And you Marina, you mentioned mining interests, but would it be fair to say that palm oil is a bigger issue and therefore something that directly affects British companies?
I don't know if it's a bigger issue, but it's definitely as big of an issue. I would say mining, palm oil, and infrastructure projects, all of those. But palm oil, especially in a certain region of Colombia, the western part, closer to the coast, is definitely an issue. Yeah.
And that leads to land grabs?
It does, yeah.
So when we use all these palm oil products in the UK, we're not sort of innocent of that?
No.
You can say more about that if you want.
Well, I don't have much more to say about that, just because it's not the main focus of the Law Society's work unless it affects human rights defenders or lawyers that are threatened because of that. Okay. But the short answer is yes, yeah.
But others maybe.
Yeah, so the broader point, I guess, here is we have an economic development model in Colombia that is very much based on natural resources and extractive industries. So this is part of the development project, including under previous governments. So this is not, in any sense, kind of exclusive to the kind of current government. Also, any student of Colombia would first point to note is that the armed conflict is intimately linked with land. And under the armed conflict, of course, there's been a reverse land reform, increasing concentration of land. So any land restitution, any kind of advocacy on behalf of land rights, or any communities that seek to act on the rights that they do have, are putting them up against very robust, strong economic, national, yes, and international economic interest.
Just maybe to add to that, for example, there are cases of lawyers who act for those communities who live in those palm oil areas, as it were, and they are seriously under threat. One of them, about 2 years ago, had 2 attempts on his life were made, and the only reason why he's still alive is because he has protection measures. He's got a car with blacked out windows and an armed bodyguard who could prevent him from being shot. So that's a practical example of the effect of victims trying to defend their rights in areas where there's palm oil industry, for example.
Thank you. Anne, you wanted to...
I was going to ask you if the National Protection Unit is worthwhile.
Yeah.
What does it do?
The National Protection Unit was set up by President Santos in 2011. Continues to this day. The current government has said that it wants to restructure the National Protection Unit. We'll have to see what that means in practice. There have been reports by civil society and human rights defenders that there are problems with the protection measures afforded by the UNP. For example, there's a level of risk analysis done when your risk is assessed as being extraordinary or imminent. You're afforded protection measures, and that can range from bulletproof vests to the cars that I just mentioned, the armed bodyguards is the highest level of risk, to a mobile phone, to a panic button that I have heard in practice often doesn't work. And if you're in a serious situation, then having a mobile phone won't do you much good. So there's that problem. Another problem is that it is severely under-resourced. So that would be one of the first things that needs to be changed in any kind of structural restructuring of the UNP. Another thing that I've heard is that there have been cases of unilateral revoking of protection measures by the UNP, delays in affording protection measures. So there are definitely a number of issues that need to be addressed.
And I think that's probably very important. It's very important to ask about the National Protection Unit. Because one of the reasons why so many human rights defenders are concerned that the state cannot deliver protection and preventing measures is because this institution is not working properly. And the further 2 things that I would add to what Marina said is, one, that only 240 members of the UN, of the National Protection Unit, are permanent staff. The others are outsourced, and this is a very serious issue because in some cases, in some of the regions, it has been proved that some of the people who are working within the National Protection Unit have links to criminal organizations. So they are the ones who are meant to protect the people and actually have these dirty ties. So it's very important to see how a reform of that National Protection Unit that can take place. And second, because the unit is not only a special task force, it is a unit that should be doing some investigations in order to identify the intellectual actors of the killings and to design preventive mechanisms. And at this moment, the National Protection Unit hasn't got that capacity to do that. So it is something that probably the international community and the UK could be looking at in order to think how it could play a more comprehensive role following a human security approach, of course, and not a national security military approach.
Carry on.
I just wanted to add to that in the aftermath of the peace agreement, there were other mechanisms set up alongside the UNP to protect human rights defenders. Probably the most important one being the Commission for National Security Guarantees. But I understand that under the current government, that commission has not really been active, not because it has been abolished formally, but just because no meetings have been called. I understood that now recently they've started meeting again in the regions, but so far that mechanism just is not used. Another thing that the current government published was a plan called the PAO. It's an action plan to protect social leaders, human rights defenders, and journalists. First, President Duque wanted to appoint as the head of this plan, or for the implementation of the plan, someone from the military, which, of course, if you know the context of the conflict in Colombia, it's not maybe a good idea to have as the head of this program to protect human rights defenders someone high-ranking in the military. That was abolished in the end, or that was revoked because of the opposition, obviously, against that. And also this PAO seems to have a kind of a public order, national security focus, rather than a kind of a civil protection focus. And the emphasis very much seems to be on physical protection measures as the ones that I just mentioned, the bulletproof vest, for example. And what human rights defenders there say is, well, that is just saving lives, but it's not addressing the root causes of why these risks exist. And then there's also the early warning mechanism by the ombudsman. That seems to work in the sense that early warnings are sent out, but then the idea is that different state institutions give follow-up to those warnings, and that doesn't happen in practice. So there are a number of different mechanisms for protection, but a lot of them just don't function in practice, apart from the UNP, with the challenges that I just referred to.
So who criticises it publicly? What sort of discussion goes on about its activity?
I guess the main problem that we have for this is that, as Marina said, the National Commission for Security Guarantees has been only convened once under the Duque administration. And why is the problem there? Because that's the high-level institution who should be doing the coordination and the articulation of all the other mechanisms. And so what he has tried to do now is to only convene it once and do regional subcommissions to deal with these issues. But the president, who should be leading this with the ministers, are not meeting on a monthly, regular basis as it should be done according to the peace deal. And that's having a very serious impact. And members of civil society who participated in that commission are very concerned that all the idea that this was going to be a participatory mechanism in which civil society and NGOs working on human rights were going to have a say in order to coordinate a plan to do protection and prevention of human rights are not being invited to do that. And that's the main also criticism to the PAO, to that plan that Marina was mentioning, because that was produced without the participation of civil society. It was only released the day before, they sent it around, but human rights organizations who had these hopes that the whole human rights policy program of the Colombian state was going to change after the peace deal, feel that they are back into the same way of doing politics before and protecting human rights that is from a national security perspective. So that's the main issue, and this is what is not being discussed probably in the Colombian media enough.
And just to address your question on the discussions that are taking place, in the media, maybe not enough. There is criticism being exercised by NGOs and by human rights defenders themselves. Internationally, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders visited Colombia at the end of last year. There is a section in his report on this, and I'm happy to send that report to the committee in writing after the session. Also, the verification mission of the UN in Colombia has reported on this. I can send that as well. And also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has also reported on this, which I I can also send. I don't want to inundate you with, but if it's helpful, then.
Tell me, do you feel the Foreign Office does enough to protect human rights defenders in Colombia?
I think there are contacts with human rights defenders in Colombia, and some of them are very well known to embassy staff. They meet with them quite regularly. For human rights defenders in the regions, it's much harder to have that contact. So one of the recommendations would be for regular visits also to the regions. That does happen to a certain extent, I think, but that could be more intensive. And also funding also for projects of local human rights defenders. I think that would be very helpful as well. The FCO has its human rights defender guidelines for posts. Of course, the Law Society was happy to form part of a group of consultation and gave input on those human rights guidelines. Lord Ahmed announced the publication of those guidelines, so we're awaiting that. And also we would hope that it's not just guidelines for posts, but that there will be more of a strategic policy around human rights defenders that would not only be shared with staff that work on human rights, but also with staff, for example, that work on trade-related issues, and that it would be a cross-departmental policy, so that also people dealing in trade or business, as we just referred to, could also take note of that. And I think there's also a recommendation maybe to the FCO and to POST to have sensitivity around these matters. There have been at least one example in a Latin American country where embassy personnel tweeted about a particular decision of a Supreme Court, saying that it was not very helpful for business in that country. And at the time, that Supreme Court had serious threats to its independence. And there were threats to human rights defenders, indigenous communities at that time. So I think some sensitization around this issue and the use of social media would be helpful. And I think that is exactly what the human rights guidelines intend to do. So we're very hopeful for their publication and implementation.
So I think what the FCO and which are doing, I think it is important, is to give the kind of discursive support to human rights defenders that is often lacking. And this is in a context where often human rights defenders in Colombia is stigmatized, and where the threat levels are, as we've all mentioned, very, very high. I think it's quite important, particularly in Colombia, to go beyond identifying individual cases where threats are real or where violence have been experienced by individual human rights defenders, and really recognize and acknowledge and try to translate it to some form of policy that this is systematized. These are not individual cases, right? There's a systematic nature to the violence that human rights defenders experience in Colombia. And that has certain implications, I think, in terms of how to think about the particular human rights issue we're dealing with. Of course, the international criminal justice dimensions to thinking about systematicity of violence that human rights defenders are subject to, and also to kind of see that the trend is one in which violence is increasing.
Thank you. Chris, you want to come on to Venezuela?
Yes, let's move on to Venezuela. If you had to score Venezuela from 1 star to 5 stars under Maduro on human rights, how many stars would you give it?
1 is the least.
1 is the least, 5 is top of the class.
1. Yeah. Should I
say, and say why, obviously. I mean, but, sure.
Rule of law. Well, I think first of all, for the rule of law, judicial independence is key. There is no judicial independence in Venezuela whatsoever. I think that's fair to say. I think since the Chavez government, what was then called the judicial emergency, a lot of judges have been replaced. We saw, for example, around 2003, a lot of judges having temporary positions, so there's no security of tenure, which obviously leaves them open to political influence. Lots of cases of suspension of judges, removal from office of judges, and there are cases by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights who have ruled on many of those cases of removed judges. In 2009, a judge, Judge Affiuni, which you may have heard of, was arrested because of a decision she took to release or conditional release a person in a particular case. That person had financed opposition groups to Chavez, and Chavez publicly said this woman should get, or basically instructed the president of the Supreme Court to give 30 years of imprisonment to this judge, or to have her executed by firing squad. She was then immediately arrested, put in prison. She stayed in prison for 4 years, was allegedly raped and tortured. She's under house arrest now, and just a few weeks ago, they finally sentenced her to 5 years imprisonment. And that case has been held up as an example to all other judges. This is what can happen to you if you don't do what the executive wants. The level of threats have increased under Maduro. In 2014, the judge that signed the arrest warrant for Leopoldo Lopez, the opposition leader, and the prosecutor who drew up that arrest warrant, both of them were escorted by the police and the SEBIN, the National Intelligence Services, and ordered to draw up this arrest warrant and sign it, respectively. The female judge was threatened with, do you want to have happen to you what happened to Affiuni? So that was used. Both of them left the country and have since publicly declared that they were physically ordered to take these decisions. And we've heard about other cases. Just recently, a judge who said that she'd been ordered to detain adolescents, so children, and she's also left the country. So there are lots of reports coming out from judges who've left the country and who now feel free to speak, and who have opened up about this. Okay. So yeah, that is, and the other thing to mention, of course, is, as you know, that the Supreme Court has been completely co-opted by the executive and has interfered to a high degree with the National Assembly, stripping the parliamentarians of their immunity, right. And that there's now the judges who were appointed to the Supreme Court now live in exile. All of Maduro's tried to arrest all 33 of them. He managed to arrest at least one. He was arrested, tortured, detained, and the rest of them left the country. And there's now a Supreme Court in exile, as they call themselves. Right. So that's just an indication of the lack of the rule of law in Venezuela.
Dr. Engstrom?
So,
1 to 5?
If you
don't
want
have to give it 1.
Right, so it all depends on the standard you use in terms of a ranking, but there's no dispute that there's human rights crisis. There's dispute about many things regarding Venezuela, still to this day. But I think there should be no dispute that there's a crisis that is multidimensional in Venezuela. So when I say multidimensional, there is a political crisis that Marina alluded to. There is a humanitarian crisis of very complex nature and dramatic, truly dramatic. We see that in terms of the refugee flows, steady refugee flows from Venezuela to neighboring countries and across Latin America, and of course as well to Europe and the US. And we see it in the human rights, more classical human rights crisis, in terms of the type of repression, the dismantling of independent institutions, which has been a process that's been underway for quite some time. I like to refer to it as a kind of complex humanitarian emergency, and I really don't find any other way of describing it at the moment. So the level of human suffering is very high. The explanations of that are, I think, also complex.
Mr. Gomez-Suarez.
Well, I really don't feel comfortable getting deep into this because it's not my expertise, Venezuela. However, I have to say that since we have been doing research in the north of Colombia, in the border with Venezuela, we have seen a large number of Venezuelans coming through our border. More than 1,500,000 people have crossed the border. The situation in Colombia is really difficult for the people who have left Venezuela. But again, when you talk to Colombians who have relatives in Venezuela and who left the country 10 years ago under the violence of paramilitary groups and who settled in Venezuela, they still think that the conditions in Venezuela are far better than in Colombia. So I guess, as Par mentions, I think the picture in Venezuela, inside Venezuela, is very complex. I believe that one of the reasons why Maduro is still in power is because, of course, holds some support of a large constituency of Venezuelan society, and that, of course, that cannot hide the weakening of the rule of law and the impact that the decisions that Maduro has taken had on the democratic institutions in Venezuela.
But the arrest of Juan Guaido's chief of staff and, as you said, the suspension of his immunity, does this feel like a nation that is in control of its own destiny, or is it collapsing into a civil war?
Well, I think a collapse is imminent. I think just yesterday evening, Guaido appeared in front of the cameras, of course, announcing that there will be a coup. I think the great unclarity is about how the military is divided, who will back him and who won't. And there's certainly a risk of escalation, but to a certain extent, that escalation has happened already, of course, over the last years, from the protests in 2017 with multiple human rights violations being committed, from torture, arbitrary detention, and forced disappearances, over 757 civilians being tried by military jurisdiction. So I think, it is certainly at a breaking point or already past it. And who knows what will happen.
And Russia and America's involvement?
For quite some time now, there have been a series of predictions about what will happen in Venezuela. So I think we need to be very careful in terms of predictions, because it is very uncertain. I mean, just now, as Marina mentioned, we have an ongoing situation in the military airport in Caracas. And since I don't have access to what's actually happened, this is the nature of the Venezuelan, as I like to call it, a conflict, which is ongoing. So there's a high degree of uncertainty and unpredictability, and that includes, and I think this is really important, that includes things can very well get worse. However bad the situation is now, it can get worse. So one should be very careful in terms of predictions. Now, on the role of Russia and US, and we could perhaps also mention China, which is another relevant actor in Venezuela. So I think the common wisdom has it that China has quite significant economic interests in Venezuela and interests in maintaining, protecting its economic interest there, and the political situation that will ensure that their economic interests are protected, that they will settle with, right, including any post-Maduro scenario, right. The Russians, again, the common wisdom is that there are kind of broader geostrategic concerns of Russia, and they provide significant support both internationally and in practical military terms to the Maduro government. The US, it's hard to tell exactly what the policy is beyond that all options are on the table, as various representatives of the US government tend to refer to it. And that includes, of course, the recurrent discussions around the possibility of military intervention. Again, I think it's hard to exaggerate how devastating any form of military intervention would be. However much there might be some degree of support among certain parts of the Venezuelan population for that type of intervention, again, the risks are very considerable, and in terms of the type of human suffering and consequences that might entail. Now, Venezuela Maduro government has quite significant support internationally from these actors from Russia and China, but also from Iran and Turkey, that provides quite important material support. Now, most readings, I believe, of the Venezuelan political situation is that the Venezuelan military will see how the day evolves, but it is very likely to retain support, practical support for Maduro. The reasons for that, I think, again, are quite complex. There are different factions within the military, in the Venezuelan military, that have different interests at stake. There are definitely economic interests in parts of the Venezuelan military. There are ideological support for Chavismo more broadly, perhaps not necessarily for Maduro personally, but the Chavismo project is, if you like, associated still with Maduro. And then there are effectively repression within the military forces that will mean that any defection will be met with harsh consequences for individual soldiers and for the family members, right? So the number of factions that makes it hard to predict how that will play out. But it is, I think, the common wisdom is that any future scenario will depend on how the Venezuelan military decide and how these different factions play out. But again, to re-emphasize, however bad the situation may look from here, and it is bad in most standards, there are potential to get worse.
Oh, good.
No.
It's good.
It's not enthusiastic.
No.
And I guess the U.S. has played a quite negative role. Also, when you think about the incident that took place towards the end of February in terms of the humanitarian aid and how this idea of bringing humanitarian aid to Venezuela was manipulated by the U.S. administration and the Duque administration to try to support Guaidó and undermine another sector of Venezuelan society, then you really start thinking about that. And I guess, this is important to bear in mind because once what you can hear from people in Venezuela is that when the threat of an intervention, U.S.-led intervention in Venezuela is put on the table, then what actually that does, paradoxically, is in some sectors of Venezuelan society to strengthen the political power of Maduro, because no one wants an intervention in their own soil. And, patriotism is quite important in Latin America. It has played a really important role in nation-building projects. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, that's something to bear in mind. Now, the second thing is that, of course, since Venezuela shares a really important large border with Colombia, more than 2,000 kilometers, and that's one of the regions where the ELN, one of the insurgencies of Colombia, is. This could also unfold in a very, not only a complex humanitarian emergency inside the Venezuelan border, but this could have a really rather complex transnational dimension, because surely some of the members of the ELN that, according to some security think tanks, have links with some of the militaries in Venezuela, they could sort of react in a way to these sort of hardline military actions, and this could spell to beyond the border of Venezuela. So I guess, as Par has been saying, it's really important that the international community is very cautious in order to try to prioritize dialogue inside Venezuelan society and avoid the use of force, because this could create a really international crisis that could put in risk even the gains that we have from the peace process between the Colombian government and the FARC.
Does anybody else want to? Catherine, yes.
How open the system is to, for example, human rights organisations gaining really hard facts about, for example, the torture situation, or so that we can get more facts, because there is a lot of CNN news coverage, but I think what's helpful to know for our committee's purposes is, are there people monitoring the situation? We had the same thing, with another conflict in Syria, knowing what are the facts about the chemical weapons, etc. In this case, what are the facts about how many human rights observers can get in, and is it possible to keep evidence so that eventually people can be brought to book, if necessary, in an international court, so that we can just gain that documentation and all that evidence so it doesn't get lost in this very tumultuous period.
Well, I think there's still a few organizations in Venezuela that monitor different things. There's Transparencia Venezuela, which is obviously monitoring corruption mostly in Venezuela. The director of that organization is herself under threat and has been for a long time, but I believe she's still there. And they put out a report on the Odebrecht scandal, the Lavallato scandal, and its repercussions in Venezuela, which is quite a comprehensive report, and quite incredible how they've been able to access even some contracts in that scandal. So there's activity there. There's the National Observatory for Prisons. They are in Venezuela, as far as I'm aware, and they put out just a week ago their annual reports about 2018, which is also very comprehensive. And then apart from that, there are a lot of people in exile. A lot of them in Florida, obviously in Miami, but also in other places. But they do still have contacts in the country. And for example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN in Geneva, they went to investigate human rights violations in the period in 2017, April to July. And they drew up their reports on the basis of lots of interviews with people in exile, because they didn't have access to the country. But there is some documentation going on, partly with organizations there, but also with a lot of people in exile. So, but of course, as you suggest, it is more limited than we would want it to be. But there are channels, let's put it that way. And also, there are some lawyers who are still in the country and who are able to travel and who have a lot of information. So there are ways. Yeah.
Ian, you wanted to?
Yeah, just briefly, Chair. Thank you. I'm slightly unclear with regards to your responses, although you have ranked Venezuela very low in terms of human rights, democracy and rule of law, whether or not you think the international community's response to the crisis in Venezuela has been positive and helped or not.
So, if I may, there have been several types of responses to the Venezuelan situation over the years, from various constellation of international organizations, international entities or countries. Whether that's in the regional context in terms of Lima Group or the Organization of American States have both monitored the situation and put forward a number of reports. Of course, Venezuela has been a standing item on the General Assembly of the Organization of American States now for many years. The OAS Secretary General, Luis Almagro, has been very active in politically diplomatically addressing the situation in Venezuela, been very critical of the Maduro government over time. There have been more, perhaps, there have been other in terms of Mexico and Uruguay and various kind of constellations, and of course the EU has taken a very active role in monitoring the situation, and of course evolving set of policies to address both human rights and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, of course, most recently in terms of the evolving sanctions regime that has been adopted. And of course, we have the International Criminal Court ongoing, open preliminary investigation on the situation in Venezuela. So, in short, there's been a lot of attention and a lot of coverage. Now, the concern that many have is that there is often perhaps limited coordination amongst these various constellations and possibly quite, at times, contradictory messages that oftentimes the Maduro government has been quite skillful in exploiting. The sanctions regime, I would like to highlight in particular, has been perhaps used as that type of edge issue to kind of split positions internationally on how to respond to the situation. I have my own personal take on sanctions, there being very limited policy utility on sanctions. If you're concerned about human rights change or political change, sanctions have limited utility, including, in my view, targeted sanctions. The sanctions regime, as it has evolved, it's unclear whether it actually has brought about any political change or willingness to negotiate. And there's, of course, plenty of evidence to suggest that sanctions, particularly over time, tend to hurt the most vulnerable sections of society. And also sanctions may have the counterproductive effect of disincentivizing any form of giving up political power. Right? In short, the national response, I think there's been a lot of attention, but a real risk of kind of contradictory positions. And of course, as I suggested in my kind of previous answer to the question here, there's a geopolitical struggle also playing out over Venezuela. And the kind of US-China, US-Russia kind of geopolitics of Latin America, we can see that manifested in Venezuela, where the concern might not be so much with the Venezuelan population, the suffering Venezuelan population, but with the kind of broad geopolitical concerns at stake. I think the only solution, if there is one, where international actors can play a role, is to try to foster as much as possible a space for some negotiation, and also to try to channel political opposition to the Maduro regime towards some degree of unity of both purpose and unity of message. And I've been saying this in previous settings, but I think also what really would be important is to be very clear from the Dutch community that use of force is not a either legitimate or effective response to the complex political situation of Venezuela. However much we can criticize and identify the current government's responsibility for crimes that are being committed.
I would like to add one point, if I may, and that is with regards to international support, something that has been overlooked and that could perhaps be a recommendation is to finance the Inter-American System of Human Rights. I know that some states finance the Organization of American States. Part of their budget is allocated for the Inter-American Commission, but it's very low. And part of that budget of the Commission is then allocated to the courts. And I think a lot of states think that if they finance the Organization of American States, that will trickle down to support the Inter-American human rights system, but it doesn't. And so if we are talking about, as the question was here, about how do we document human rights violations in Venezuela to then afterwards be able to do something with it, of course the Inter-American Commission is the main body where that kind of information can be compiled, that holds sessions where people can testify and where all of this work should be taking place and to a large extent is taking place. But there are huge pressures, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, Commission own resources. So I think that's definitely an avenue to finance the Commission directly and the court, although of course in Venezuela, Venezuela denounced the American Convention on Human Rights in 2012, so the court no longer has jurisdiction, but that would be another recommendation.
Good. May I just add very quickly on the point here that was kind of suggested earlier, I believe, with regards to international criminal responsibility, international criminal justice, and of course that leads the discussion to the role of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, with regards to Venezuela. As I mentioned, there is an open preliminary examination, and there have been quite concerted efforts by including certain Latin American states and heads of government to get the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC to more actively pursue cases. I think we need to be very modest, however supportive the UK, of course, officially is of the ICC, and I think it should remain supportive of the ICC. We should, I think, be modest in our belief and hope that the ICC can be used as some form of conflict resolution mechanism. In my view, I think it cannot. And also, what we're talking about here, I think, also needs to involve thinking about transitional justice more broadly, and what different transitional scenarios might look like in Venezuela, and how justice would fit into that scenario. And of course, accountability and anti-impunity efforts are very important, but I think one needs to think very carefully about the design of various amnesty provisions to incentivize individual leaders and military officials to effectively give up some of the influence, or perhaps leave their positions of power in the country. There is a very delicate balance here, for sure, between, on the one hand, incentivize political change, and on the other, ensure that there's a degree of accountability for the very serious crimes that have been committed. But to believe and put hope and approach the Venezuelan situation with the sole prism of international criminal justice, I think that is deeply, deeply problematic.
Very quickly, just that I think it's about keeping a body of evidence which could meet a certain threshold, so that nationally there can be, at some point in the future, a sense of reconciliation. So we know from other peace scenarios like South Africa that where it's nationally led and done well, it can have a big knock-on effect positively for the country. So it's less about necessarily just the word punishment, but it's something about that national and not just forgetting, because then otherwise you lead to other problems if you try and forget and have lack of accountability and lack of justice.
If you allow me to add a footnote to what has been said, is probably I would make a stronger point to say that I think that the international community is a bit co-responsible in the production of the crisis. I think the economic sanctions that freezing some of the assets in 2013 really have contributed to create a very particular landscape in Venezuela, and there's some research being done on that. So I guess that when we think about what's happening in Venezuela and the changes in the geopolitical landscape with the arrival of Donald Trump in 2016, and with this shift to a neoconservative geopolitical moment in Latin America, we need to be also conscious about the different roles that the different actors play, and how that helps and radicalizes like these sort of regimes, and help to co-produce to create the crisis, but because they are somehow related to the decisions of the international community.
It doesn't